"Look at that, that's cool." That simple phrase once echoed through countless episodes of American Pickers, capturing Frank Fritz's or whenever he stumbled upon a forgotten relic. But Frank was no ordinary collector, and his garage was far more than a storage space. After his death, what authorities discovered inside stunned not only fans but even the police. Behind those doors wasn't just a collection of vintage cars, it was a secret. Beneath layers of dust, they uncovered a vehicle that, according to all official records, shouldn't have existed. Why was it there? And why did Frank leave behind a handwritten note suggesting it was part of something much bigger? This wasn't just another hidden gem, it marked the moment everything changed. What lay inside Frank Fritz's garage was more shocking than anyone could have imagined. Frank Fritz wasn't just a man who liked old things, he was driven by obsession. He didn't simply collect cars, he hunted them. For him, each rusted fender or faded hood ornament told a story. Since his first appearance on American Pickers, it was obvious Frank wasn't in it for the spotlight. He was in it for the thrill of the chase, the history behind the machines, the silent voices of time echoing through worn chrome. To most viewers, Frank was the quieter half of the duo, quick-witted, encyclopedic in his knowledge of gas station signs and oil cans. But for those paying closer attention, his passion ran far deeper. You could hear it in his voice when he stumbled upon a muscle car swallowed by weeds, or see it in the way he lingered a little longer in some forgotten barn. His collection wasn't flashy, it was intentional. Frank didn't build a showroom or seek applause. He built a sanctuary in Iowa, filled with vehicles that were more like time capsules than trophies. There was a 1956 Chevrolet Bel Air with sweeping tail fins and classic lines he adored. A 1967 Ford Fairlane GT390, bought for $7,000, into which he poured another $4,000 to restore. Then there was the 1960 Cadillac Fleetwood, a fully auctioned piece of American luxury, purchased with longtime friend Mike Wolfe. But Frank's devotion didn't stop with sentimental favorites. He wasn't afraid to spend big on what he believed deserved saving, like the pair of 1954 Nash Healey sports cars he picked up for $46,000, or the rare 1914 Met cycle car, a three-wheeled oddity worth $35,000. But the crown jewel? A 1947 Cicitalia Nuvolari Spider, a post-war Italian marvel, lightweight, stunning, and staggeringly rare. It was worth over $500,000. Each of these cars had a story, and Frank could recall every detail, where he found them, how he got them, what they meant. These weren't investments to him. They were rescues. They were proof that the past, though buried and forgotten, still mattered. What set Frank apart was how he protected that passion. He didn't flaunt his collection online or host celebrity-packed garage unveilings. His garage remained locked to most, a sacred space of dust, grease, and memory. Friends said he could spend entire afternoons in there, tinkering, cataloging, or just sitting quietly among the machines that meant the most. In a world obsessed with sharing everything, Frank kept his treasures close. And that's where the mystery begins. Because not everything Frank found made it to television. Not every deal was public. Over time, he became more private, more withdrawn. His garage, once a symbol of joy and discovery, turned into something sealed and shadowed. Even those closest to him didn't know exactly what was inside. And when he passed, and the heavy doors were finally opened, what was found inside changed everything. But before we get to that shocking discovery, we have to understand just how deep Frank's obsession truly ran. For some, his pursuit of lost machines was never about money or even the objects themselves. It was about something much more personal, the belief that some things are worth holding on to, no matter how forgotten they become. As Frank's time on American Pickers dwindled, so did public access to his world. What began as a temporary absence due to back surgery became something more permanent. By 2020, Frank had quietly exited the show, citing health issues. Fans hoped for a comeback, but the reality was more somber. His physical decline wasn't just a rough patch, it was the beginning of a downward spiral that marked his final years. Those close to Frank said he withdrew. Calls went unanswered, visits were few, and he rarely left home. But that home wasn't ordinary. It was his museum of memories, a living testament to a life spent chasing stories, not fame. His garage, dusty, locked, and silent, held more than machines. It held secrets. And one of them, buried under decades of passion and privacy, would soon rewrite everything people thought they knew about Frank Fritz. Certainly. Here is your rephrased and organized version, structured into natural, vivid paragraphs for flow and clarity. In his final years, Frank Fritz's restoration work began to take on a different tone, quieter, more cryptic. He no longer spoke openly about what filled his garage, and even those closest to him hadn't set foot inside for years. Publicly, there were only occasional glimpses, a Facebook post showcasing his 1939 Plymouth Coupe with a caption hinting at how proud he was to own it, another mentioning the satisfying growl of his restored Ford Fairlane once it roared back to life. But as time passed, the posts stopped. The updates vanished. And as Frank's health declined, the garage doors remained firmly shut. Despite no longer being on the road for American pickers, Frank never stopped acquiring cars. He adapted, sometimes sending a trusted middleman to evaluate potential finds, other times buying them sight unseen. It wasn't reckless, it was instinct. After decades in the trade, Frank knew what to look for. Each purchase was intentional. One of the final confirmed additions to his collection was an odd vehicle with faded paint, no chrome, and no markings, nothing flashy, just an unusual shape that made people pause. When a neighbor asked about it, Frank simply replied, "It's older than you think," before wheeling it into the garage and closing the door behind it. That was more than a year before he died. Frank was never the kind of collector chasing popularity or volume. He wasn't concerned with trends or appearances. What mattered to him was meaning. That's what made his final years feel so mysterious. If he kept collecting while battling illness and withdrawing from the world, what was he really searching for? Whispers floated through the antique auto community, rumors of a secret list, vehicles tied to forgotten automotive myths, one-off prototypes, lost race cars, factory concepts that had never made it past the sketch phase. One story claimed he was negotiating with a retired GM employee over a vehicle no one had seen since the 1960s. Nothing was ever confirmed, just echoes and speculation. But there were clues. Before his death, Frank made cryptic remarks to a few longtime friends. He once said, "There's something in that garage that'll outlive all of us." On another occasion, he reportedly told someone, "If they ever open that garage without me, tell them I left everything behind." At the time, those words were brushed off. Frank had always been poetic, a man of stories. So when the end came, it was quiet. No grand farewell, no press release. Just silence. The man who once lit up millions of screens passed away surrounded by the things he loved most, solitude and untold stories waiting to be discovered. As the legal process began and his property transitioned to estate handlers and investigators, attention turned to the one place that had remained untouched, his garage. Locked. Undisturbed. It was more than just a storage space, it was a sealed archive of a life dedicated to chasing the rare, the forgotten, the unbelievable. And when the key finally turned and the doors groaned open, the people involved were about to see that Frank hadn't just been chasing the impossible. He had caught it and hidden it in plain sight. The day they opened Frank Fritz's garage, there was a chilling, almost reverent silence. Not the kind heard at a funeral, but the eerie quiet that comes when people realize they're stepping into a place that has gone undisturbed for years. Police officers stood at the edge of the gravel driveway, their hands resting on their belts, exchanging silent glances. The estate attorney held the key, and behind the heavy roll-up door, the weight of years and secrets waited. Until that moment, the garage had been sealed under court order, part of the legal process of inventorying assets and safeguarding potential valuables for probate. No one truly knew what lay behind the door. From the outside, the building looked unremarkable, an aging steel structure, ivy curling around the edges, and a dented side door that hadn't budged in a decade. But the moment the door was slowly lifted, dust poured out like smoke, and so did the gravity of what Frank had left behind. Inside were 8 vehicles, parked in tight formation. Some were covered in dusty tarps, others exposed to time but still striking in their forms. Near the front stood the turquoise 1956 Chevrolet Bel Air, its vibrant body dulled but intact. Beside it, the 1967 Ford Fairlane GT390, one of Frank's most cherished muscle cars. In the back corner gleamed the Cadillac Fleetwood, elegant even under layers of grime. The garage was a museum, frozen in time. But then came the shock. Near the rear wall, covered in a torp stained with old oil, was a vehicle no one recognized. Parked at an odd angle, it didn't match anything in Frank's known inventory. Its shape was unusual, low-slung, curved aggressively, with an oddly wide rear. One of the officers cautiously approached and peeled back the cover. The atmosphere shifted. It was a Corvette, but unlike any Corvette anyone had seen. Its lines were sharper, its body more aggressive. It looked handcrafted, almost experimental. Certainly. Here's your revised version, structured into rich, dramatic paragraphs that maintain the mysterious tone while improving clarity and narrative flow. The vehicle looked like it had come from a dream, or perhaps a secret. Its nose dipped unusually low, its back end flared wider than any known Corvette design. Most peculiar of all was the absence of a traditional VIN plate in any of the expected locations. Instead, riveted to the firewall was a small brass tag. The lettering was faded, and the sequence of numbers engraved on it matched no known GM production record. It didn't belong. The police officers on scene noted it. The estate attorney jotted it down. But no one dared touch the vehicle beyond that. Still, they couldn't stop glancing back at it. Something about it felt off. On the inside wall of the garage, just above the workbench and barely visible beneath layers of grime, a yellowed note had been taped. The ink had bled in spots, but the words were unmistakable. I left behind everything there. It was signed simply, Frank. The message didn't explain itself. It didn't need to. It felt intentional, like a final breadcrumb, left behind by a man who knew he wouldn't be there to explain it himself. When a local mechanic was brought in to inspect the vehicle, he shook his head in disbelief. What he saw wasn't just rare, it wasn't supposed to exist. It bore all the hallmarks of a 1963 Corvette Grand Sport, a race-bred beast of which only 5 had ever been built before GM pulled the plug on the program. All 5 were accounted for. Yet here, buried in the shadows of Frank's garage, sat a 6th, or something eerily similar. But there were inconsistencies, minute differences in the fiberglass body, strange proportions in the frame, and that haunting brass tag marked experimental use only. How had Frank found it? Where had it come from? And why had he kept it hidden all these years? The man who had built a life sharing his discoveries with the world had kept this one thing utterly private. The garage that no one could touch had just given up its first secret. And it wouldn't be the last. Frank Fritz's death left behind more than just grief. It left behind a mystery, a challenge. One that would soon draw in vintage car experts, automotive historians, collectors, and skeptics from around the world. Everyone wanted to know the same thing: how had one man, quietly living in Iowa, come into possession of a vehicle that may have been buried by one of America's largest car manufacturers? The story gripped the classic car community. When Frank's garage door creaked open after years of silence, no one expected anything out of the ordinary. His collection was well known, documented by fans, fellow collectors, and magazines. The 1956 Chevrolet Bel Air. The 1967 Ford Fairlane GT390. The duo of 1954 Nash Healey sports cars. The incredibly rare Cisitalia Nuvolari Spider. These were familiar names, legendary in their own right. But no one expected that car. It was parked at the very back, beneath a dirty grey torp. Its shape was unmistakably Corvette, but distorted, more aggressive, more stylized, more secretive. As the top was peeled away, confusion set in. The fiberglass bodywork echoed that of the original Grand Sport, but the details didn't add up. No VIN. No factory markings. Just that cryptic brass plate and a presence that made the room go quiet. Frank had never mentioned it, not in interviews, not on American Pickers, not even in casual conversation. A man known for sharing every find, every score, every forgotten gem, had kept this one car to himself. Deliberately. Quietly. That's when people began to take another look at the note taped above his workbench. "I left behind everything there." Once interpreted as a sentimental farewell, it now felt more like a riddle. A clue pointing to something bigger, something unfinished. The car unsettled people. Corvette experts were divided. Some believed it might be one of the so-called lost mules, test vehicles built alongside the Grand Sports, meant for racing or development, but never officially acknowledged. Others believed it was even more unusual, a one-off prototype, possibly constructed in secret by rogue GM engineers using original molds, then hidden away for decades. However it came to be, it ended up in Frank's hands. And he had guarded it with obsessive care, never registering it, never displaying it, never even mentioning it. He tucked it into the darkest, farthest corner of his garage. Not as a trophy, but as a secret. Something waiting. Now, after his passing, that secret was out. The car that shouldn't exist had finally emerged from the shadows, pulled into the light by the same man who had spent his life chasing the rare, the forgotten, and the unbelievable. And as news of the discovery spread, it triggered a tidal wave of speculation. Corvette forums lit up. Historians debated. GM remained silent. Some called it the most convincing replica ever built. Others dared to believe it could rewrite a piece of American automotive history. One thing, however, was certain: whatever this car truly was, Frank Fritz had taken its secret with him to the grave. And in the end, it wasn't the money, the fame, or even the mystery that lingered. It was the sense that Frank had done exactly what he set out to do. He had rescued something that didn't want to be found, and preserved it in silence, for the world to discover only when he was gone. Certainly. Here is your rewritten version, crafted into engaging, polished paragraphs with a steady, narrative flow and emotional resonance. What made this discovery extraordinary wasn't just the car itself, it was the impossibility of it. Frank Fritz, a man who built a life uncovering lost treasures, had left behind one final mystery. There were no headlines. No film crew. Just 4 wheels, a brass tag, and a locked garage harboring a secret that never should have made it this far. The questions began almost immediately, and they haven't stopped since. The car's discovery didn't just stir curiosity, it pried open a vault of unanswered mysteries that even Frank's closest friends couldn't explain. It wasn't just about identifying what the car was, it was about why it had been hidden, how it ended up in his possession, and whether it was ever meant to be found at all. When word of the car made its way into niche automotive forums, the ripple effect was immediate. Vintage racing communities dissected every photo. Corvette historians tried to match it to every known prototype, test mule, an early concept sketch from Chevrolet's short-lived Grand Sport program. But for every answer they thought they had, new questions emerged. The biggest among them: was it real? If the car was an undocumented Grand Sport prototype, then Frank had somehow acquired a vehicle that General Motors never officially acknowledged. And if it wasn't? If it was a replica, built from stolen blueprints or long-lost factory molds, it begged an even bigger question: who built it? The craftsmanship was beyond reproach. Every line, every weld, every mold curve carried the fingerprints of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Then came the rumors. One claimed Frank had purchased the shell and key parts from a retired GM engineer back in the early 2000s, long before his health began to decline. Another suggested he'd quietly picked it up through a private estate sale near old GM testing grounds in Flint, Michigan. Nothing was ever confirmed. But the stories wouldn't die. And in a strange way, they made sense. Frank was never the kind of collector who craved applause. He sought out the obscure, the overlooked, the forgotten. His garage wasn't curated like a showroom, it was a workshop, a retreat. A place where something like this, something controversial, something impossible, could be hidden in plain sight. What unsettled people the most, however, wasn't the car. It was the silence that followed. GM refused to comment. When asked directly, a company spokesperson claimed they had no record or knowledge of such a vehicle. Still, whispers persisted from former engineers and insiders, more grand sports may have been built than the public was ever told, test models, unofficial builds, possibly hidden away when the program was shut down. If Frank's Corvette was one of them, its existence would be the leak in a story never meant to resurface. And then there was the note. I left behind everything there. The longer people stared at it, the less poetic and more deliberate it seemed. Maybe Frank knew this would happen. Maybe it was his way of lighting one last fire, of making sure the story didn't die with him. Or maybe, just maybe, it was his final joke, a quiet nod from a man who spent his life finding the things no one else could. As the story spread, offers started pouring in. Museums wanted it. Private collectors made bids, some without ever seeing the car in person. One international buyer allegedly offered a blank check. But the estate didn't move. The car remained untouched, in legal limbo, surrounded by experts and attorneys who still couldn't agree on what it actually was. And Frank? He never said a word about it, not on camera, not in interviews, not even in passing. That silence lingers now, hanging in every rerun, every quote, every clip. Not once did he hint at it. He didn't keep it secret because he had to. He did it because he chose to. Whether it's a lost prototype, a factory ghost, or the most brilliant automotive hoax in modern history, one thing remains true: the truth is still locked away, just like that garage once was. And maybe, in the end, that's exactly how Frank wanted it. Not everything he found was meant to be explained. Some things were just meant to be found. Long after the estate proceedings began, the car still sat, silent, untouched, and impossible to ignore. Experts came and went, each more intrigued than the last. But none could reach a definitive conclusion. Too many unknowns. Too few answers. And Frank wasn't around to fill in the blanks. That's what makes this story different. It's not just about a car, it's about a man who saw value where others saw junk. A man who didn't chase status or headlines. Frank Fritz collected for the thrill of discovery, for the satisfaction of rescuing beauty from obscurity. This final discovery, whether it turns out to be a lost grand sport or a one-of-a-kind phantom, captures everything Frank stood for. Mystery. History. Reverence. He didn't share it because, perhaps, that was never the point. Maybe he wasn't waiting to be recognized. Maybe he was content just knowing it was safe. In death, Frank left behind more than machines. He left behind a message: collecting isn't always about proving what you found. Sometimes it's about preserving something simply because it matters. Sometimes, the greatest treasures are the ones you don't put on display. And that car, the one that shouldn't exist, is now part of Frank Fritz's legacy. Whether it's ever verified or remains an exquisite enigma, it carries his spirit more than any documented antique ever could. Because in the end, it was never about showing the world. It was about keeping something alive, behind a locked door, inside a dusty garage, protected by a man who understood the quiet power of what's left unsaid.